So he says, chapter 6, verse 4, we've been buried with him, with Christ, through baptism into death, so that as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in the newness of life. This idea of newness, like, this is what we're hungering for, in our souls. Not to get away from this world, but to see it renewed, to see signs of hope, to see signs of life.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Faith Lab. I'm Nate Hansen, and joined today by Nijay Gupta, Dr. Nijay Gupta, New Testament scholar at Northern Seminary, and he's got a new book out. It's called Paul for the World, and I'm also joined today by another guest that's been on the show before, Shane Rosenthal, and we're trying something new. We want to chat about what was Paul's actual gospel? Like, what did Paul actually think? We had N.T. Wright on recently, and Tom was talking a lot about, his new book and how we're not going to, it's not about leaving this earth and I'll fly away,
Right.
oh glory. But that's the picture we've had. And you say that's not what's actually going to happen.
Yeah, well, first of all, guys, thanks so much. I love having these conversations. And, my passion is I hate when people say, oh, the Bible's not relevant. I always go back to like Hamilton the musical. If you were to pitch a musical about the founding fathers, it would be very easy to pitch it in a way that's going to sound very boring and dull. And to have a wonderful story about forgiveness and love and family and hope. And when I look at the Bible, I see the same thing that, oh yeah, thousands of years ago, but gosh, it's about family and love and hope and beauty and justice and truth. So thanks for leaning into this conversation. So you ask a good question. I grew up in the 80s and 90s, the era of progress. And I grew up believing I could be an astronaut, fighter pilot, president of the United States. And I had a conversation with my youngest daughter a few years ago. We were at the dinner table. My oldest was going to college. And we said to my youngest daughter, what do you want to study when you go to college? And she said very matter-of-factly, will the earth still even be around when I go to college? Like, that was not in my 1989 brain at all, this idea that things are going down the tubes. And so the whole notion of, I use the language of quiet quitting your life, of the sense of despair, like we're just going to disappear into our phones, disappear into our dystopian literature, and kind of just lose any sense of there being meaning in existence. I think that's real. It's real for young people. I have 3 teenagers. They're not thinking, they don't have a 30-year plan. They don't even have a 5-year plan. They're just trying to get through class and have a little fun. And
Well, you add
think
in
too much
now
about
too. You add in like the AI stuff now too. It's like I struggle
Yeah.
with this too. I'm like, I don't even know what life's going to be like in a year from now. Like, am I going to have a job? Like, is it going to be, are we even
Absolutely.
going to be having these conversations, or will it just be like our faces, avatars of ourselves having these podcasts? Like what's the future even?
And I talk about the bulletin of the of the atomic scientists, which is started in I think the 1950s, 60s with Oppenheimer and Einstein. And they have this thing called the doomsday clock that counts down to midnight. And every year these scientists will update the clock. And it started at, 2 or 3 minutes to midnight. Now it's down to just, a bare number of seconds. And one of the quotes from the most recent statement, 2025, that I read was, proceeding on the same course we've been on is a form of madness. And so that's kind of the world we live in. It's super sad. I mean, the pandemic, and I was just talking to, kind of a door-to-door solicitor about rising utility costs. She's selling solar energy. We've seen a 110% increase in our utilities here where I live over the last 10 years. And so people wanting to escape from their life, whether it's video games, whether it's social media, getting sucked into social media, just despair, just giving up. There's all forms of it. And I think actually the Bible, but the gospel gives us incredible resources to come back to this age-old question, but that many of us are feeling very powerfully. What is the meaning of existence? Why are we here? What are we here for? What are we supposed to do with the 50, 60, 80, or sometimes 15 or 20 years that we're on Earth? What is life? What is the meaning of life, basically? And I remember writing this book, Paul for the World, a couple hundred pages, and I had a conversation with AI about it. And I said, "What do you think this book is about?" And they said, "I think it's about the meaning of life." I'm like, that needs to go in the subtitle then. So we did.
Mm, wow. Yeah. No, it's interesting because I mean, like I say, the AI, what's happening with AI now, and like, um, it's hard to imagine the future. And I think there's this idea, like you said, of escapism and about. I mean, I remember growing up, and I grew up Christian, and I remember thinking like singing the hymns like "I'll Fly Away, Old Glory,"
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
and just having this picture of like, things are horrible here and they're going to get worse, kind of this like dispensationalism, right? It's going to get even worse. It's going to get
Left Behind.
crazy.
Yeah,
Yeah, left, right? Um and then but then like the trumpet will sound and it'll all be over, and it's like, okay. And then once I make it to that
yeah,
side, or if I die, right? And then I make it to that side and it's like, phew, I made it through. You picture, like, I'm a big football fan, right? You picture like the drills they do where they're like the guys like running and they're like hitting the pads, and like they're hitting them with like the
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 Gauntlet.
sticks as
Yeah,
the gauntlet, right, as they run
yeah,
through.
yeah,
You picture like
yeah,
that, and it's like, whoo, but you made it to the other side,
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah.
uh,
How do
yeah,
we get out of here?
right, yeah,
Yeah, this
I'm
is the
particularly
great escape
fascinated
room.
by the way that, Jesus totally transforms our our vision of everything. I mean, he tells his disciples in at the Last Supper, um, you know, the the pagan rulers like to enforce power over their subjects, but it shan't be with you. You're going to be different. And then he models that by washing their
Hmm.
feet. And that it was so objectionable to Peter that Peter actually
Yeah,
rebukes
yeah.
Jesus and in turn is rebuked. But
It's like, it's a trick. Yeah,
that whole idea that, of a servant leader, starts with Jesus. And I think if you sort of let that resonate in your own soul for just a year or two or 20, it can revolutionize everything in your life.
yeah,
And
yeah,
not just, your view of the afterlife, but starting here, like,
yeah, yeah.
how can I embody servant leadership in my role, all my different callings as a husband, a father, a truth teller, an elder, whatever my callings are, my main vocation. It's a radical idea, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think I did grow up like many of you with this mentality that Christianity was fire insurance. It's you tuck it away for when you really need it, at the end of all things. And Shane, with you, you're saying there's actually I'm hoping my book will be a completely different way to look at Paul, but also the whole Bible. Instead of looking at it as this form of escapism, let's escape into our churches so that we can have a feel good moment, we can have a taste of heaven in those four walls. What if it's actually completely different than that? What if this world we live in actually is the big event? I think it's First Peter, where Peter says, "Angels long to look into these things," the glory of Jesus. And the image I have in my head is like the dome of heaven is like a glass floor, and these angels, like, we're thinking what's going on up there, and they're actually have their faces pressed to that glass, like, what's going on down there? Like, we think the action's all up there, and they're actually up there going, actually the action's down here. That requires a paradigm shift.
In particular, I think that passage is talking about like the way in which the story of Christ unfolds in the Bible.
Yes. Yeah,
The fact that he's
absolutely.
hidden, he is the mystery of the ages, the promise of the new covenant, all those rich themes in the Old Testament that shine with brilliant clarity in the new. And yeah, if the angels are longing to look into that, perhaps we should do it in our churches occasionally.
It's a good advice.
So you thought about Paul a lot, DJ. What do you think Paul would say if we had, instead of 3 people on this podcast with us, if we had 4, and the
Yeah.
Apostle Paul was here, what do you think he would say? Like, okay, okay, Paul, give me your summary. What is the good news then? What do you think it actually means?
Yeah. Man, that's tough. That's tough. It's like choosing your favorite child or something because he has so many good things in his letter. So I actually thought about this ahead of time. What would I say? The classic answer is 1 Corinthians 15. I will just mention it in passing and then we'll get to sort of, I like to shake it up. But Paul says 1 Corinthians 15, Christ died for our sins according to scriptures, buried, raised, appeared to multiple people. Um, I think that's helpful, but I don't think that's where the energy behind what it all is. Most people when they hear the word gospel, they think conversion. They think get me out of hell. They think um, I wanna be on God's good side.
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
is the basic, and I don't to me, like, that's just the beginning. That's like step one of like a big step forward into a new world. And so the immediate place when you sent me that question ahead of time, the immediate place I thought was Romans chapter 6, which rephrases 1 Corinthians 15, but actually shows the end game. So he says, uh, chapter 6, verse 4, we've been buried with him, with Christ, through baptism into death, so that really is the important part, so that as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in the newness of life. If there was an alternative title to my book, it'd be Paul in the Newness of Life or something like that. That's probably not as sexy, but this idea of newness, like this is what we're hungering for, in our souls, not to get away from this world, but to see it renewed, to see signs of hope, to see signs of life. Um, I don't want to get super, super political here, so we don't have to dwell on this, but I've been working on a Substack essay, and I kind of start and stop, and it's called uh, how Pope Leo might save evangelicalism, which is supposed to be ironic because he's not evangelical.
Right.
But like what we're seeing through people like Pope Leo is a vision, a cruciform, newness of life vision of how Christians can bring flourishing and goodness, not just to an afterlife, but to this life. Like how can instead of saying, "Hey, this world's going to hell in a handbasket, we're bailing out, come with us," having a vision for how do we bring things back to life here? AJ and I are my co-podcaster. We have a podcast called Slow Theology. We did an episode, maybe a few months ago called Living Like You're Never Gonna Leave. This was AJ's idea, but I loved it. And his idea was when you go stay at a hotel room for one night, you got your little kids with you, whatever, it's pretty typical that you trash the place. Like towels everywhere. I'm really bad in the sense
We're
that
learning
I'm
a lot
like,
about you. No, I'm kidding.
I know, right? My wife is like, pick up after yourself, turn off all the lights. I'm like, screw it, like throwing towels everywhere. And I've come around now where I'm like, I make sure when I leave all the lights are off and everything. But like, if I think I'm never coming back, this isn't where I live, then you just trash the place. And yet, what do you do with your own home? You're like, we had someone come over, we're like, take off your shoes. This is a no shoes house because we want the place clean. We have to live here. And so that actually affects how we think about our life and the world we live in today. If you think I'm just counting down hours and days until I get out of Dodge, then we could just trash this life. We could trash this world. But if this actually is the big, beautiful experiment called Earth that God created, then there's a lot more at stake. And this is actually something that's been given into our stewardship that we have to actually think carefully about, not only the Earth, but our own lives.
I
The
wonder
newness of life. Yeah, going
if
back to
there's
the
a
newness of life.
danger there at all of if you think about 1 Corinthians 15, which you started with, that focuses on the objective work of Christ and all that he accomplished by his death, burial, and resurrection. Paul calls that the gospel,
Yeah,
the thing of
yeah.
first importance. If we if we focus on our response to the gospel, the fact that we've been buried with Jesus and have been made anew, that is certainly part of things. But sometimes I wonder if the response becomes all that people think in terms of the gospel, because that's the part that they're involved. So
I
when
see.
we
Yeah.
focus primarily on the subjective instead of the objective, that gets internally attested to. I know it because I feel it. I experience it. I walk through it. Instead of listening to the main contours of what Paul emphasizes, this happened. It was attested to by witnesses, and it was
Mhm.
seen in advance by the prophets. That's where I think the emphasis falls. And then it's not just an objective fact. It has theological significance. It was not just a death, but a death for sin. So when you frame it that way, it has objective and subjective application. But I think sometimes, especially in the last 150 years, everything took a subjective turn after the Enlightenment rationalism. The subjective turn was only to focus on the experience, or in some cases, in some liberal contexts, the renovation of the world is the gospel, without even referencing Christ. What do you think?
There's definitely a danger that you can slip into of kind of making up as you go along, or it being wrapped up in your feelings. There's a couple of biblical scholars, David Bauer and Robert Traina. They use the language of transjective, where they're trying to show our experience of the objective happens through our life, and therefore it's an intermixture, interpenetration of reality, which is real, and our experience of reality, which is the only way we know reality. So I think even in a text like First Corinthians, sometimes people take these texts, they think this was just sort of a leaflet that was passed around. Here's the doctrine of the gospel. This comes in the midst of a lot of correction that Paul gives to the Corinthians. So I think he has to
Yeah.
remind them of certain realities of what Christ has done in the past, the importance of the human body based on Christ's own body, what we do with our bodies, sacrifice versus only self-empowerment, things like that. So yeah, I think you could see the error going either way, and so there's definitely a both and to achieve here. One of the errors, what you're talking about, is an overemphasis on feelings, experience, my truth, that sort of thing. There's a piece of that that's important, but it can't be the whole. But I think I've seen the other extreme too, where people say, hey, if we nail a copy of the Ten Commandments to, a courtroom, that will solve all our problems. Actually, that happens in the context of a covenantal relationship with God. So it doesn't exactly work by just nailing it to a wall. That's not a magic wand. In fact, in Jewish uh, understanding, the first commandment is actually, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of Egypt.
That's
That's how
right.
they count the Ten Commandments. They start with that one. It's not actually a commandment. It's a truth. It's a truth about God. So I think, yeah, there's a both and there. What I want to communicate to people is the gospel isn't just God wiping away your sins. It's actually God transforming you into the human being you were always meant to be.
Yeah, I think that's really beautiful too, to think of it that way. I've struggled with it more because it is a lot easier. Partially, I think, because like I was raised with the whole idea, and I taught it for years as I was, pastor in California, and I mean, I taught the whole like, guys, we could die at any moment, and then we're gonna be, we're gonna be gone, and it's like, so let's go live crazy radical lives in light of this. And that's not unique to Christianity, certainly. There's other religions that live radically because of the faith they have that there's something better after this life. I guess, yeah, I guess it's hard to think about too. I remember I asked Tom write this question too, just like what's the picture then? Because we all have this picture. We have the old picture in mind. It's hard to picture this new reality, I guess. What I mean, do we just like look at what Jesus was doing in the gospels and the stories we have there and try our best to be like, okay, so that's like what Jesus did is how we should be. That was an example for how we should live, or like I guess like practically speaking, I'm curious from both of you, like what do you like? How do you think this actually impacts um, our day-to-day lives.
One thing I discovered in my research for Paul for the World, I find it pretty profound, but it's almost one of those things that should be really obvious, is the Bible says over and over and over again why we're here on earth. And the word that it would use in the New Testament is paideia. Paideia comes from the Greek word for child, pais, and it means the concept is to grow up from being a child to being an adult. That's what paideia means. And we see it all over the place. For example, all scripture is God-breathed and useful, teaching, rebuking, correcting, and paideia, training in righteousness. So we actually have a mandate while we're here. We actually have a goal. I used to think we're just here to go to church, worship, and just sort of wait for the bus to heaven to show up. It's actually much bigger than that. It's much bigger than that. I remember when I first got married, my wife is a marriage therapist. When I first got married, my wife said, "Nijay, what are your goals for our marriage?" And my question back was, "Marriages have goals?" I thought the goal of being married was to just stay married. And her explanation was a marriage is like an organism. You got to cultivate it into greater health, or it'll suffer and die. And this is how it's presented in the New Testament as well, whether it's the parable of the sower. You need sunlight, you need nutrition, you need, the right soil and water, or else you're just going to spring up and wither away. You need protection from the weeds, that sort of thing. And so we actually have a goal. If you read Philippians chapter 1, Paul says, live your lives worthy of the kingdom of Christ, worthy of the gospel. And that is really challenging with an overly simplistic theology, because we think, oh, when I go to the pearly gates, I used to be taught in high school, when you get to the pearly gates, you'll have a mask of Jesus you put on, and God will just say, "Hey, I welcome you just like I welcome Jesus." Yes, that's true, but there's
Like
also
you're kind of like
some
sneaking
sense.
in, kind of. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was that sort of thing. It's cool though, and there is some sense in which that's true because we're being conformed to the image of Christ. There's a sense in which we are, if you just do a word search of the word worthy in Paul's letters, it comes up a lot. His goal wasn't just to convert people to Christianity. It's really clear in his letters. It was also to offer them to God as sacrifices pleasing to God. 1 Corinthians or Romans 15:16. That's
Yeah,
much
and in
more
Romans
than
12, he
just.
says that all of life is worship. Just offer
Yeah.
up your bodies
Yeah.
as reasonable sacrifices.
Yeah. So, imagine with your kids, I have 3 teens. Imagine I just said, "Hey, there's a library out there somewhere. Here's some beef jerky and hope you make it the rest of your life." Uh that doesn't make any sense. We would never do that with our children. We cultivate them. We support them. We nurture them. They take shots. They eat vitamins. They exercise. All that stuff. It's the exact same way with who we are as believers. As when you become a newborn Christian, you are just that, a newborn. And there is an expectation, according to Scripture, that we're going to walk in the newness of life and grow into the person that we're meant to become. Even though Paul says in Philippians, "I'm not perfect. I haven't reached there," meaning even the most famous Christian is not even close to the image of Christ perfectly. But what does he say? I'm moving in that direction. I'm
Yeah,
dead set on
we're all
moving in
being
that direction.
conformed to that image. I guess the way I would put it would be that we are called to worship Christ and live lives worthy of the gospel, but our living and being conformed to is not the gospel. I'm not the good news. Jesus is the good news, and it's good news that I'm incorporated into Christ. Would you agree with that way of putting it?
Paul uses the word gospel in many, many different ways. He could talk about it as news. He could talk about it as almost a world unto itself in the gospel. He could talk about worthiness of the gospel, which I would call a culture. I'd probably have a little bit bigger, I'd zoom out a little bit more. When he says, for example, in Philippians 2, holding fast to the word of life, as light in the darkness, in the dark world. I don't know. I mean, get up on a high hill, you herald and proclaim good news. I think the good news messenger becomes part of the good news by proclaiming it. And so, I think about Martin Luther saying every Christian is a little Christ. That doesn't mean we died to save the world. But if we're making up for what is lacking in Christ's affliction, there's some sense in which we carry on that. This is why Paul says, you'll do even greater things than John the Baptist, that sort of thing. Gosh, I would say we are not the center of the good news, but by being the body of Christ, uh, w- w- people's contact with the good news happens often, almost always through us, and in that sense, we're a part of it.
How much weight would you put on Paul's language of the thing of first importance there in 1 Corinthians 15, that this particular way of framing the story is the most important part of the story? His death, his burial, his resurrection, his death for sin in particular. The according to the scriptures part of it, that the fact that he calls it good news, he's tying it to an event. It's news, an
Yeah,
event that's
yeah,
already happened. See, the fact that my part of the story hasn't even happened when Paul wrote this. This would be 2,000 later. Our stories
sure,
come later. But
sure.
he's saying it's already a completed event then. Thoughts?
Yeah, I would say, that was the NIV. I would say, uh, foundational importance. Foundational importance would be probably the way I'd say it. Uh, Yeah. It's interesting because, he has 13 letters, perhaps more, because there's a couple missing letters to Corinthians we don't have. He never says it the same way uh, more than once. He says it this way here. He says it a different way in Romans. He says it a different way in Galatians and Philippians.
Do you agree that here he's
So
quoting an early Christian creed?
almost never do I believe that. I'm a pretty high skeptic when it comes to textual archaeology, where we try to
Yeah.
dig beneath and get to. I don't know if you
Interesting.
guys know who John Dixon is. He's a good friend. He's a Wheaton College early Christian historian. And we had probably like a 2-week Twitter feud. We're close buds, so it wasn't a hostile thing at all. But every day or two, we would go back and forth in this one thread. This was like maybe 10 years ago. And I would say there's absolutely zero benefit in trying to look for preformed traditions. And he'd say, aren't you curious? I'm like, no, I'm not curious. So I will tell you one that I think is foolproof, and that's in Ephesians, wake up, O sleeper, and Christ will shine on you. I think that is a pretty foolproof piece of early Christian tradition, because it's not in the Old Testament and it's not anywhere else in the New Testament. But other than that, I'm a pretty high skeptic. I think Paul could have come up with this stuff, or it is a summary of things that were often said.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, interesting. I'm curious too. This is maybe shifting gears just a little bit, but I in the past, as listeners of the show know, I deconstructed my faith. I was on the verge of losing my faith, and before I closed that door completely, because it's such an important part of me, I was like, well, I want to re-examine this, and so got into looking at the evidence again and looking at a lot of scholars. Richard Bauckham was a big one for me, and others. Shane's show, obviously, people know this story, but dealt with a lot of people and talked to a lot of people and heard a lot of stories of doubt and people leaving the faith. And there's still a lot of listeners like that of this show too. And I know you've done a lot of work. You have the podcast with AJ Swoboda, and he's written on deconstruction. I think I'm curious, how's your what are your thoughts on the whole movement? And you're in Portland here with me. It's a
Sure.
very,
Yeah.
very progressive city, and I'm just curious your thoughts on all of it, and how you think this plays into basically, is some of the work you're doing, are you trying to speak to these people who are having a hard time figuring out their relationship to Christianity still?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I heard a pastor say a couple years ago, the biggest question that the world posed to Christianity in the 20th century was, is Christianity true? And the biggest question that the world is posing to Christianity in the 21st century is Christianity good? And I found that a really compelling, it's very broad, right? And it relates mostly to Western countries, Western environment. But I think that's true because I grew up with, Josh McDowell, Lee Strobel, you know, these heavy hitters on sort of historical stuff. And I don't get these questions a whole lot from students. I don't get these questions online a whole lot about, did Jesus really exist? Did he really die on a cross? I don't even get, did he rise from the dead? My Portland neighbors don't care. One way or another, it doesn't really strike them. But when a neighbor my wife is an evangelist. She shares Jesus with everybody. Everybody knows she's a Christian. She's president of PTA. She's right now volunteering for an auction. And people will very regularly be like, I'd love to check out your church. And they're not really checking it out because they believe in the historical Jesus. We want them to, but that's not why they're checking it out. They're checking it out because their heart is craving something deeper in life. And when they go to a church, they're not testing it for truth claims. That's my sense from many people that Amy, my wife, has invited to church. They're really testing it for resonance with what their heart's asking, what their soul is asking, that there are biblical realities, truth, beauty, justice, wisdom, that just is speaking to them. And so I don't set out to write for a specific group of people, except people that those who have ears, let them hear, kind of thing.
Yeah.
That doesn't work with my publisher if I say I'm just writing for those with ears. But it is that sense of I'm not one of these people. It's like I'm trying to correct every theologian that's come before. However, I do think there are very superficial, one-dimensional ways that we've heard the Bible taught that has a sort of shallow resonance. Oh, yeah, okay, yeah, Lord, liar, lunatic, or whatever. Like stuff that just seems compelling, but then once you start living it out, you're just saying, I feel like there's got to be more to it than that. And so a lot of my stuff really deals with, like, for example, in this book, Paul for the World, I have a chapter on depression and wellness. And often when I pitch a book to my publisher, it'll be sort of a hunch. I'll sort of give them a table of contents that I haven't worked out yet and said, I'm hoping I'm going to find some gold here. So as I was researching for that chapter, I just discovered, gosh, Paul's been through a lot.
Yeah.
He talks about being shipwrecked, being hungry, being beaten, being lonely, having enemies from his people, from other people. He talks about being under the sentence of death in 2 Corinthians. I mean, you read 2 Corinthians, it's a pretty dark text. And yet, I think Portland 2026 really resonates with the things he's writing. Here's a guy who doesn't have it all together, in the sense that he's figuring life out a day at a time. God's telling him, go here, then go there. He's got a lot. He doesn't quite know who his friends are, who his enemies are. He's always looking, watching his back. He experiences deep loneliness. He experiences deep friendship and joy. He has moments in 2 Timothy, one of my favorite texts, where he says, everybody left me at my defense. Nobody came to my side. Everybody in Asia, I don't know how many Asians he knows, that everybody in Asia has turned their back on me. I don't know if he knows like 1 billion people or just 10, but he said all the Asian Christians have turned their back on me. And I feel like the people that tend to resonate with us today are people that have lived life with lots of scars. We like to hear, I'm getting a little off topic here, so you can bring me back, but
It's good.
My wife and I, my kids and wife and I, we like watching superhero movies. And, back when I was growing up, the superheroes, the Supermans were impervious. They were alien and impervious. And the stories we're telling now about superheroes, they're vulnerable. They lose their powers. They're weak. They make mistakes. There's a controversy over the Superman 2025. Is he too weak? He's getting beat up by. I really love it. Because I'm like, I want heroes who are just a little further along than me, right? who point the way forward, but if they're perfect, then I'm like, I'm never like
Yeah.
that worked in 1980. That doesn't work for me in 2026. So
But
I
what
feel like
didn't
Paul
work for
gives us that.
anybody in the first century was this idea of a God who would be so weak that he would be crucified. It was actually a
Yeah,
hard
absolutely.
teaching.
It
And the
was.
only
Mm.
reason that it was compelling was because it was true.
Yeah. 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 I remember when I wrote this book called Strange Religion, and I came to the conclusion, until Jesus, there was never a patron god of the weak who himself was weak. Yeah, that's it right there. Um, there are lots of gods of healing. Asclepius, obviously Yahweh is a god of healing. But to have a God who knows weakness and suffering and isn't ashamed of it, uh, that's a whole other story. And if you read a book like Dominion, Tom Holland, not Spider-Man, the other Tom Holland, I mean, that's the foundation of it all.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking, I mean, we could jump back to like talking about where this all came from. This like the gospel equals ticket to heaven.
Yeah.
That takes us back 100, probably 200 years. I don't know. You all would probably know that better than I do. How did we get to that point? Because it doesn't seem like I've listened to multiple people now talking about that's not what they were talking about. It's not what the Christians were thinking about. It's not what Paul was talking about. It's not what Jesus was trying to communicate. And then I look through my Bible and I go like, yeah, I don't see it. I don't see it there. You're right, Tom, right? You're right, Nijay. You're right,
Nijay,
Nijay.
no
But
problem.
but
Thank you. That we can end now after you've said you're right, Nijay. We can be done now.
clip that.
No, I'd like to hear.
Clip
I'd
that.
like to hear Shane. You might have a bigger picture of this than I do. I can give you sort of my inclinations, but I think Shane may have put
Well,
more thought into this historical question than I have.
I'd be tempted to connect it to dispensationalism because you have that idea that the rapture being imminent, what you need is an escapist theology that goes with that. And once that happens, I think late 1800s, it sort of reframes the way the gospel is told. And I've heard Christians talk about that. They connect the gospel to being accepted at the rapture, and it just, I think, reduced in many circles, especially with the popularity of what's his name, the uh, the 1970s books, that sort of emphasize the Israel
Late great.
Reborn, Late Great
Yeah.
Planet
Oh,
Earth.
okay.
That's the book I was trying to think of. The
Yeah.
popularity of those themes, man, I think it really reduced and truncated the gospel to that sort of ticket to heaven view.
Well,
My my. Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was gonna say, but there's also like, I mean, death is scary because we don't know what it is and we don't know what happens after that. And so, like, it part of it too. It feels like you kind of want something to just believe in that. Like, you can have all these thoughts. I can even have these thoughts of like, yeah, it's probably not that. Like, right? I don't see that in scripture. But then, like, if I'm dying, I'm like, yeah, like I don't know where am I going? Like, do we just, yeah? How do you like uninstall that? I guess too. But yeah, what were you gonna say?
Well, I was gonna say. I mean, to the credit of those in the past that have thought that we die and go to heaven, the Bible says a whole bunch of different things, and when you shake it up into sort of theology potpourri, uh, it could be really confusing because you have Jesus ascend into heaven. Okay, he's human and divine, so he's going up into heaven. He says, I'll prepare a place for you. That's confusing too. You have the earth being rolled up like a scroll. You have the grass withers and flowers fade. You have sort of these crazy visions in Revelation of temples sizes that don't make sense, and sort of geographic and organic things that don't make sense. You have rivers flowing with milk and honey, which doesn't fit our normal human experience. You have Edenic stuff that doesn't fit our normal human experience. So I think some of that is symbolism, that is evocative but not literal. Like I tell my students, why are the streets made of gold when titanium would be way better? But they just didn't have titanium, so they use gold in that image, right? To make sense of, I'm dairy free, so it's like, will I have better lactase enzymes in the afterlife, and
Rice, milk,
therefore
and
I
honey.
can
Yeah.
drink directly from cashew milk,
Cashew milk?
and
Okay.
some oat milk.
That's probably better for you than what
And
I'm
if there's
drinking.
honey, will there be bee
Yeah.
stings? That's another question.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh,
Can
there
we
you
feed
go.
honey? Can we feed this honey to 2-year-olds? I don't know. So I think to the credit of people that have said, no, you die and go to heaven, I think there's plenty in the Bible that will lead you to believe that. I think N.T. Wright, you've already had him on, but he did a good job of saying there's life after death, and then there's life after death. You have Philippians 1 where Paul says, I'd like to depart and be with Christ. What does that mean? Because he's up there in the control room in heaven. So does that mean we go there? I do think some of it is the impact of Platonic dualism that says physical things are bad and there's this world of perfect ideas and logic and forms. And we all kind of still cling on to that because it sounds good. Like, my son broke his collarbone. He got surgery. He has a huge cut on his clavicle here from the surgery that's going to be a scar, and he's going to have to live with that. So it's like, does that go away? I can't wait for a new body. I have a scar on my arm of similar kind. Does that go away? So when we hear everything's going to be perfect, we think, I got to get rid of this body if everything's going to be perfect. I'm going to let you guys in on some information that's not going to be public for a while. I'm writing a Substack post on why C.S. Lewis is wrong. I know it's clickbait.
I don't think you're allowed to say
I know it's
that.
I
Do we
know
all
it's
need to do
clickbait.
like a thumbnail right now? Like,
You can. This could be really draw people in this episode. But we could talk about this because I think it's fascinating. I absolutely love C.S. Lewis. My son and I read The Great Divorce recently. I read Screwtape Letters in seminary, and I had him read Screwtape Letters recently.
But he does lean
Mere
toward Plato here and
Christianity.
there.
Yeah, I'll tell you why I'm bringing this up. So one of my favorite quotes from Lewis, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, if I have a desire in this world, if I have a desire that this world can't satisfy, then the only logical explanation is, do you know how that ends?
Yeah.
I wasn't.
That we
I
were
was made for a different world.
another
Or
world.
I was made
Yeah,
for a different world.
Yeah.
Interesting. This is in Mere Christianity in a chapter on hope. And I had to reread this chapter multiple times to make sure that how correct I am that he's wrong. So in the context of that saying, I never looked up what the context saying is. He's talking about heaven and earth. And he's saying, he keeps talking about, he has this great saying, if you aim for heaven, you'll get heaven and earth. If you aim for earth, you'll lose both. It's a great saying. However, it's completely theologically wrong. And I even say in this post that it'll come out in May, but when I say in this post, if you turn around the saying, if I have a desire, into its direct statement, we all know it's wrong. And the direct statement it is I was made for heaven and not earth. If you take that saying and you actually simplify it to exactly what he's saying, de-Lewis it. If you de-Lewis his rhetoric, which is amazing, and you just make it a plain statement of saying I was made for heaven and earth, well, that is exactly why Wright wrote that book, Surprised by Hope, that is the fundamental problem. And then if we take Lewis seriously, and I say in my essay, I don't even think Lewis believes that, because it's ludicrous if you think about it, because clearly Adam and Eve were made for earth.
That's right.
And some people will say, oh, by world he means age or stage. I say this in my book, but he doesn't say that in the essay. He keeps talking about heaven and earth. And so there's this, even in Lewis, who is this giant of a thinker in the middle of the 20th century, I think he makes a profound mistake of using the word world where he really means age. The New Testament actually uses the word age, aion.
I completely agree.
For this idea,
Yeah.
we weren't made for this age where sin and death dominate. We are made for a more perfect world, but that world is still earth. Psalm 115 says, the other gods, the other Mesopotamian religions, they all have temples and statues, and they basically believe their gods live on earth through these kind of avatars. And yet Israel has this temple, but they don't have any statues, right? They don't have cult statues. They're aniconic. They don't have these false images. And so the other nations
shocked Pompeii.
Absolutely. Yeah. These Pompey, yeah. That these other nations will say, hey, you don't have a real God because you don't have a statue. And their response is in Psalm 115, Yahweh is the maker of heaven and earth. He lives in the heavens, but he gave the earth to mortals. That's their way of explaining this, and it is actually correct. That is the correct way of thinking about it, is the heavens are God's throne, the earth is his footstool, meaning the earth was meant to be an extension of his home. And this actually, if we jump to the New Testament and we talk about Philippians 3, where Paul says, we wait for a Savior from heaven who will come. We are citizens of heaven. We await the Savior who will come and transform our bodies. This is colonialization language. And so N.T. Wright and Mike Bird, they talk about a colony, living in a colony like Rome and Philippi. The goal wasn't to someday make it to Rome. The goal was to transform Philippi into wait for it, Rome away from Rome. I love that. I love that saying. And if you think about Earth was meant to be a Rome away from Rome. It was meant to be a copy of heaven, but our own version of it here on Earth. So Lewis is completely wrong here. I hate saying it. We weren't actually made. So the name of the series of essays I'm doing is called Made for Heaven on Earth. We weren't made for heaven. We were made for heaven on earth. And that little change in language can be the difference of giving up on this earth and trying to reclaim it.
Yeah. I think in terms of like the general message you hear at a funeral, it's often, Bob is now up in the clouds looking down at us all and just, having a great time. He's now golfing forever because that was his favorite sport. You basically take, if heaven is a place, whatever your joy was here, that's what you do forever in the clouds, maybe with
Right.
a harp. And it doesn't, I mean, it's a Greek pagan view of the afterlife. I mean, the kind of rich theological language you get in Isaiah is that there's going to be fine aged wine. Very unplatonic, actually. It's this
Fields, work,
amazing
farming.
feast.
Yeah.
And so there is an afterlife, but it's not at all like the way most people conceive it. So I've got a question about your book, A Beginner's Guide to New Testament Studies. You have a section where you talk about the fourth gospel, and there are
Yes.
some questions about its historicity. As you know, there are many people who've argued over the last 100 and something years that it was the latest of the four gospels. It was theology, not history. But there's been a new trend in New Testament scholarship. I don't know if you're familiar with this new book by George Van Coten,
Yes.
who is the
Yeah.
Cambridge professor,
I know
who's
George.
recently arguing that John may actually be the earliest of the Gospels. I'm not convinced with him on that. I do
Yeah.
think it's a pre-70 text, however. What are your thoughts about some of the changes that are happening in New Testament scholars about the fourth gospel?
I'm actually doing a Substack series to a book by Michael Gorman on John and Paul in harmony, and it actually also argues from a leading New Testament scholar that John is earlier than Paul in some ways. Predates Philippians, for example. I haven't read the whole book, but I read enough to know that he says that. I think this is part of a longer-term rehabilitation of John. People have been overly simplistic by saying John's the spiritual gospel, John's the allegory. John has been known widely, Robert Kaiser famously, as the maverick gospel. But one of my good friends, Paul Anderson, has always talked about a bioptic tradition, meaning we've had Mark and we have John. They're actually two streams of tradition. Matthew and Luke follow Mark, but John's always been there as a kind of second witness to the life of Jesus. I will tell you a couple things. One is I don't put much stock in chronological debates. Did John know the synoptics? Did the synoptics know John? And all that. Was John independent? It's so much speculation. I think one thing that a number of Johannine scholars. Well, let me tell you a story. Actually, I'm being a little evasive here, Shane, but I'll get back to it. Let me tell you a story about 10 years ago, maybe longer, more than that. There was a conference at Wheaton in honor of N.T. Wright, and there were a group of scholars that were critiquing his work. And I happened to be there. It was like a transfiguration moment. I was like, let's make tents and stay here forever. It's like all these bigwigs: Richard Hayes, Mary Mike Thompson, Kevin Van Hooser, N.T. Wright, Jeremy Begbie, all in one place at one time. And Mary Mike Thompson actually got up to the microphone and she gave a lecture, and she said, Tom, when you wrote Jesus and the Victory of God, which was N.T. Wright's massive tome on the historical Jesus, she said, you all but ignored John explicitly. You explicitly ignored John. And she said, why would you do that? Like, that seems like a huge oversight. And he got up and he said, if I had included John in the conversation, no one would have read the book. No critical scholar would have read the book because they would have just dismissed it as evangelical nonsense. And he wanted to play by kind of the Academy rules. And, this was maybe 2010, I don't know, when he gets up and says this. His book was written in the 90s. And I think, Shane, the situation has changed.
It has.
Where Van Kooten can write this book and make this
Yeah.
argument, Gorman can write and make this argument. Some things that have changed are, number one, recognizing actually things in John that are actually more realistic to a real person's life.
Yeah.
For example, that Jesus would regularly visit Jerusalem. That he didn't just wait 3 years. Like, he's a good Jewish man. He's going to go regularly for the festival. So he's going to be there and back, every now and again. Another thing is names. I think Pete Williams has done work on the realistic names in different regions, the naming of regions, some of things like that. One really obvious one is in the Gospel of Mark or maybe Matthew, Jesus gives these pithy one-liners and then leaves. Much more realistic is that he gives these really long discourses like John chapters 14 through 16. He's going to have really extensive teaching versus these kind of one-liners. That's not to downgrade the synoptics, but to say John actually contains a lot of really important information for understanding Jesus. Some of it is just the ways we've abstracted the Gospel of John in ways that are unfair. So, the Gospel of John presents Jesus as too high Christology, meaning he's too godlike, not human enough. I actually think that's incorrect. So if you think of like a wavelength going up and down, John actually has a big wavelength, but that means he has a high up. Whoever's seen me has seen the Father, but he also has a pretty low down, meaning Jesus is thirsty. Jesus is angry. Jesus needs things from other people. So when people say it has a very high Christology, it actually also has a very low Christology, maybe in some ways the lowest. But I think that wavelength is really important to John. The way I explain it is I would not separate out John as less historical. I do think, number one, the narrator plays a bigger revelatory role. John is very interested in putting the pieces together for the reader with lots of editorial information, which I think is really helpful, right? He was talking, he's whispering in your ear. He's talking about his body when he talks about the temple.
When he
they
said
did not
this, he was
understand
speaking
this
about the
until
kind of
after.
death he would die.
Yeah, these things are written that you may believe. So John is doing extra narrativatorial. That I just made that word up, but he's doing extra narration work there. But it's going to take a little more work to get the historical juice out of John. It's there for sure. People have dismissed it because of the way it begins. But some things in there. Mary My Thompson's point, you can go back because they published the essays. Her point was it's a huge mistake to ignore John, but it will require more sophistication to extract historical information out of John than you would out of, for example, Mark.
Yeah, I remember reading James Charlesworth, a Princeton scholar, at 2019 book, Jesus Mirrored in John, and he says that the Academy no longer has a basic opinion about the date. It's no longer there's no longer a consensus among scholars about the date of John or its lack of historicity. That used to be. It's not a conversation you can have anymore. It's no longer a consensus that it's theology, not history. And one of the things he says is like just an example he gives is the water turning into wine scene in John chapter 2. It sounds kind of like this mythological Jesus, boom, zap, the water is now wine. But when you look at the details there about these stone pots that were made, we actually have archaeological information that corroborates the story. It's only written about in John's gospel. No other texts write about that, but we find stone jars used for Jewish purification in the very city that he describes it.
Yeah.
And he just lists a whole bunch of data like that.
Totally. And Bacchum has been really good on this kind of stuff. One of the things my students will ask me is when I present a view on something, they'll say, is this the consensus view? And what's
Mm.
interesting is, the main academy is the Society of Biblical Literature in America. What I say now is there isn't really one big amoeba of scholarly view. There are actually schools, right? So in a hypercritical school, which leans more American Academy of Religion, they're going to dismiss John. Absolutely. And then on the far right, you're going to have kind of certain evangelical schools that, take it as word for word. But in the middle, there's a whole bunch of other schools. So are we talking about, progressive evangelical groups? Are we talking about Catholic scholars? Are we talking about Jewish scholars? Are we talking about European scholars? Are we talking about Australian? Are we talking about, so there's really isn't, Shane, you said it right. There's no consensus in the capital C version of that. What there are lots of micro communities. And there's a downside to that in the sense that we're not talking to each other as much as we should. But there's an upside to that where you're not going to get kicked out of, out of the conference because you have a different view.
Yeah. And I do think it's also a good day to not emphasize the consensus, but to emphasize the evidence and the doctrinal sort of the fact. Well, the fact plus meaning equals doctrine. So we have to have both, which is, I think, a missing emphasis on the conservative evangelical side, because all you have on the conservative evangelical side is sort of the feeling and the what it means to me kind of a thing. But I think what the apostles keep referring to are these facts with the significance built in, which is why it's worthy of our trust. These things really happened and they're really significant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was a
Good
big
word.
part of my story. Like, I'm sharing it with you before we jumped on here, Nijay, but about like looking at the evidence and like coming back, and that was the piece. I had drifted pretty far, but like, and I know there's listeners out there that are like, yeah, what evidence? Like I thank you for your emails. But
Sorry, I sent you a few emails about this, Nate.
yeah, it was you, and your Reddit posts. I did see those Reddit ones too about me. Thanks, guys.
Put a
But
mustache on when I sent you those emails, though.
it's you. It's been you all along. Okay, I guess to land the plane as we wrap up our conversation, maybe we can sit here at the end, get super practical, and all of us think about, what does this actually change? We've talked a lot here about how our paradigm needs to change. There's a lot of people trying to do this work right now, which I think is really good work to say, listen, this is not a escape from Earth. It's not a jailbreak. We're staying here, right? We're essentially staying here. Heaven is coming to Earth. New creation, these kinds of things. So what does this look like, practically speaking, tomorrow, next week, for our churches, for our communities? We're living in neighborhoods, we're going to schools. What does this actually look like? And maybe tie into, because I know you wrote a book on this as well, but like with the earliest Christians, what made them strange, and like what did they believe, and like what were they? I'm always trying to get back to like the original. Like, what were they thinking?
Yeah,
I want to have that mind too. So yeah.
That speaks to my heart, Nate, because that's my job. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to get back to the original recipe for sure. I heard this story. I don't remember where I heard it, but it stuck with me. There was an atheist talking to a Christian and a Jewish man. And the atheist said, "What's the difference between your two religions?" And the Christian started talking through doctrines and, Christian theology. And the Jewish man said, uh, a Jewish person worships God 7 day a week, and a Christian worships God 1 day a week. Now that is completely wrong, and yet it's an excellent indictment of too many Christians and the way they think that if I make it to church, gosh, I'm going to try and make it to church. I'm going to try and make it to church. That they've done their Christian duty. That they've checked a box. That they have pleased God by showing up to church and singing some hymns or whatever, drinking some grape juice or whatever it is. And that's just completely wrong. I've been thinking about paradigms of the church, and there are different paradigms of the church, and I haven't come up with all the ones that I'm going to use in my Substack. But one of them is, the cinema. We go to church to be entertained. We show up. We want it to be fun. We want it to be enjoyable. The other is the fortress. We show up to church to get away from the yucky people out there. And I've met loads and loads and loads of people that are in that boat where they have kind of their holy water and their cross, and they want to, seal off the door and stay inside to keep all the, all the sinners out. And the image I want to lean into, I haven't found the perfect one, is the church as hospital and school. We're
Yeah.
there to heal and be radiated by the presence of Christ, the worship of the church, the teaching of the church, to go back out there and to be salt and light and beauty and truth and goodness and justice to the world. And that idea of equipping, right? Equipping the saints for ministry. That's what I hope that my work will energize people towards, is saying, I want to love church so much that I can't wait to get out of church. It's a crazy idea, but I want to have the best 3 hours in church so I can have an incredible 6 days and 21 hours not in church.
Don't you think part of the
Yeah.
problem is the way we think of worship as music, or worship is a service, and the New Testament does not speak that way. Worship
No.
is just giving weight to God and to Christ, and how do we give weight to that? How do we honor that? We honor it through our lives. And if you look at the beginning of Romans chapter 12, I mean, it starts with all of life is worship, but then it moves on to, be hospitable to others. That's how we translate this into real life, ways. And I think once you start to realize that there is no other story like this. This was announced in the Old Testament before it happened. Sometimes it's Jesus in the Old Testament doing the announcing and hinting. And it's all fulfilled, and it's the most bizarre story that no one would ever make up, a crucified Messiah who we still worship. And once you sort of wrap your head around that the God of the universe exchanged his life for ours, he gave himself for us, and that's a glimpse into who he is, then it transforms everything. And why should we only think about this once a week, or even half-heartedly think about, as I drift in and out of the sermon? It's a totally different thing that I want to invest my life into this. I want it to transform everything.
Love it. Good job. Good word, Shane.
Yeah, I always joke that like it's there's always that one sermon. Worship needs to be everything. It needs to be like our whole life, and the church will usually have the worship leader give that sermon one. They never preach, right? But there's like one time a year they get up and
the
give
one
that
where it feels a little ironic.
Yeah, they like, no, we're supposed to worship like not just in the music. I know you see me up here leading the music, but worship's everything every day. And but yeah, we need to bring that into daily life, and let's explore what that looks like. I really appreciated your conversation. I appreciate the books that you're writing and the podcast that you're doing. And where can people find out more about all the work that you're doing?
Yeah, for me, definitely my podcast that I co-host with AJ Swoboda, theologian extraordinaire, who you definitely should talk to sometime in the future, near future. It's called Slow Theology, and we just talk about the messy stuff of the Christian faith. We just finished a series on the Beatitudes. We've done the Apostles' Creed. We talk about the challenging stuff of everyday life, some deconstruction stuff, but a lot of just finding Jesus in the mess and fog of life. I have a Substack, which I've mentioned, called Engaging Scripture. I do devotionals, I do book reviews, interviews with scholars, a lot of guest writers. I'm doing a series right now called The One True Gospel, trying to find the truth of the gospel in this sort of many falsehoods that are around us. And that has a whole bunch of guest writers. It's been super fun. And then through my new book, which you're helping me tell people about today, which is called Paul for the World, A Grounded Vision for Finding Meaning in This Life, Not Just the Next.
Awesome. Thank you, Nijay. I really appreciate this. Enjoy the Portland sun.
Thank you. Thank you both. I appreciate the conversation.